The battlefield was silent now. Smoke rose slowly from burned tanks and broken machines. The smell of metal, fire, and dust filled the air. Sergeant Mark Hayes moved carefully through the ruins. His boots crunched on broken glass and burnt soil. He had seen many battlefields before, but this one felt different. It felt too quiet, too empty, as if the land itself was tired of war. Mark was a medic, and his job was not to fight, but to help those who were still alive. He searched for anyone who might need help, human or not. Most soldiers had already been taken away, but there were always some left behind, too wounded to move, too forgotten by their squads. As he walked near a collapsed wall, Mark heard something strange. It was soft, weak, like a whisper carried by the wind. He froze and listened again. Yes, there it was, a faint breathing sound. Someone was alive. Mark pushed aside the broken pieces of stone and metal, his hands working fast. Soon he found her. She was not human. Her skin was pale green, covered with dirt and blood. Her silver armor was broken, and her long hair was tangled with dust. Her large violet eyes were half open, staring at nothing. She was very young, maybe his own age or younger. Mark recognized her species at once, Varelian. For a moment, he hesitated. The Varelians were the enemy. His orders were clear. Help humans first, report enemies to command. But when he looked at her face, he saw no threat, only pain and fear. She was not holding a weapon. She was just lying there, waiting for death. Mark sighed. He knew what he was about to do was against the rules, but his heart would not let him leave her. He knelt beside her and checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. She was still alive. He quickly opened his medic kit. "Stay with me," he said softly, even though he knew she might not understand his words. He cleaned her wounds as best as he could, wrapping bandages around her arms and chest. The girl moaned softly in pain but did not resist. Mark gave her water from his flask and wiped the dirt from her face. When he was done, she was still breathing, but she could not move. She was too weak. Mark looked around. If a patrol found her here, they would finish her off or take her as a prisoner. She would not survive either way. He made a quick decision. Mark carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her through the ruins, staying low and quiet. Every sound made him nervous, the distant hum of drones, the crack of falling rubble, but he did not stop. At last he reached his shelter, a small hidden place under the remains of a crashed transport vehicle. He had used it as a temporary clinic for wounded soldiers. Now it would be her only chance to live. Mark laid her gently on a blanket and checked her bandages again. She opened her eyes slightly and looked at him. For a moment they just stared at each other. A human and a Varelian, two enemies on opposite sides of a bloody war. Mark gave her a calm smile. "You'll be okay," he said softly, though he was not sure if it was true. The girl blinked slowly, as if trying to understand him. Then her eyes closed again, but this time her breathing was a little steadier. Mark sat down beside her, tired but relieved. He knew he had just taken a huge risk. If anyone found out, he could be punished, maybe even removed from his unit. But he did not care. He had seen too much death in this war. If he could save even one life, even the life of someone who was supposed to be his enemy, then maybe there was still some good left in the world. As the night grew darker, Mark stayed awake, keeping watch over the wounded alien girl. Outside, the battlefield was silent, but he knew it would not stay that way for long. For now, though, there was peace in this small shelter. And for the first time in weeks, Mark felt he had done something that truly mattered. The first light of dawn slipped through the cracks of the shelter. Mark woke up with a start, his hand on his rifle, but all was quiet. He looked over to where the alien girl lay. She was still breathing, but her eyes were now open, fully open. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her large violet eyes followed him carefully. There was fear in them, but also confusion. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her body and she fell back with a soft cry. "Easy," Mark said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt. Stay still." She tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words, but his calm tone seemed to stop her from panicking. He slowly reached for his medic kit and showed her the bandages, pointing to her injuries. Then he mimed wrapping his own arm. The girl hesitated, then gave a weak nod. Mark worked carefully, changing her bandages and cleaning the wounds again. She watched him closely the entire time, her gaze sharp but no longer as frightened. When he was done, he poured a little water into a cup and offered it to her. She looked at it suspiciously, then back at him. Mark took a small sip first to show her it was safe, then handed it to her again. This time she drank. Good, Mark said softly, smiling. You need strength. She blinked slowly, as if trying to understand the meaning of his tone, and then made a small sound, something between a hum and a whisper. Mark guessed it was her way of saying thanks. The hours passed quietly. Mark cooked a small meal using his portable heater. The smell of warm food filled the small shelter. The girl's stomach growled, and Mark could not help but chuckle softly. He offered her a piece of bread. At first she refused, but hunger won. She took a bite, chewing carefully. Mark noticed how tired she still looked. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, though he knew she might not answer. She stared at him for a long time, then touched her chest and said softly, "Lyra." "Lyra," Mark repeated. "I'm Mark." He pointed to himself, saying his name slowly. She blinked, then copied him, pointing to him and saying, "Mark." That small exchange felt like a victory. For the first time since the war began, Mark felt a thin bridge forming between two enemies. The next day, Lyra tried to sit up again. Mark helped her, placing a small cushion behind her back. She pointed at the bandage on his shoulder, an old wound he had ignored, and made a questioning sound. "It's nothing," Mark said with a shrug, but she insisted with a firm gesture. Amused, Mark let her look at it. She carefully unwrapped it and, with surprising skill, applied fresh bandages. "You're a soldier, aren't you?" Mark said softly, watching her work. "Or maybe a scout." Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she touched the broken badge on her armor, which bore the Varelian crest. She said a few words in her language, her tone sad. Mark guessed she was explaining how she got left behind. For a while, they just sat there in silence. Outside, the wind howled softly over the empty battlefield. Mark knew he could not keep her here forever. If his unit found out, they might take her away as a prisoner. He did not want that. Over the next few days, he slowly taught her simple human words: water, food, safe, using objects and gestures. She learned quickly, and soon she was even smiling a little when she got the words right. One evening, Mark noticed her staring at a photo he kept in his bag, a picture of his family back home. She pointed at it curiously. "My family," he explained. "Home." She looked thoughtful, then drew a small circle in the dirt, adding tiny shapes around it. She pointed to it and said something softly. Mark realized she was drawing her own home, her own people. In that moment, Mark saw her not as an enemy soldier, but as someone far from home, someone who just wanted to go back. That night, as he kept watch, Mark made up his mind. He would find a way to get her to safety, not to a prison camp, but somewhere she could heal and maybe return to her people. It would be dangerous. It might even cost him his place in the army. But looking at Lyra, sleeping peacefully for the first time, Mark knew it was the right thing to do. Outside, the war was still raging, but inside the small shelter, a fragile trust had begun to grow, a trust that could change everything. 3 days passed in the quiet shelter. Lyra was healing slowly, and she could now sit up without help. Mark noticed her strength returning, though she still moved carefully. The air outside was no longer filled with heavy smoke, but the battlefield was still dangerous. Patrols searched the ruins every day, both human and Varelian. Mark knew time was running out. If they stayed too long, someone would find them. One night, as Lyra slept, Mark sat in silence, thinking. His orders were to report enemy survivors, but his heart refused to let him do it. If the army found her, she would be taken as a prisoner. Or worse. He could not allow that. When dawn came, he made his decision. "We leave today," Mark told her as he packed his medic kit. He pointed to the horizon, then to her, and finally to himself. "Go. Safe." Lyra tilted her head, unsure, but when she saw the serious look in his eyes, she nodded. Mark helped her stand. She was still weak, but could walk with support. He gave her a small piece of bread and filled 2 flasks with water. He hid his medic badge and took only what they needed. Traveling light was the only way to survive. They slipped out of the shelter quietly and made their way through the ruins. The sky was gray, the air cold. Each step felt dangerous, as if the whole battlefield was watching them. At one point, they heard the sound of an engine. Mark quickly grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her behind a pile of rubble. A human patrol truck passed by, scanning the area with bright lights. Mark held his breath, keeping Lyra close and silent. The truck moved on, and only then did they dare to move again. By midday, they reached what was once a small town. The buildings were half destroyed, windows shattered. The streets were empty except for scattered metal and burned vehicles. Lyra stopped and stared at a broken sign with strange human letters on it. She touched it gently, as if curious about the meaning. City, Mark explained softly. Before war. She looked at him with sad eyes, then nodded. It seemed she understood. As they moved forward, they heard another sound. This one different. Not soldiers. Not drones. Mark raised his hand, signaling Lyra to stay quiet. From behind a wall, he saw a group of scavengers moving through the ruins. They were humans, but not soldiers, carrying makeshift weapons and searching for anything valuable. They're dangerous, Mark whispered. He took Lyra's hand and guided her through the shadows, avoiding open spaces. But one of the scavengers saw movement and shouted. Mark cursed under his breath. They ran, weaving between broken walls. Lyra stumbled but kept running. The scavengers gave chase. Mark spotted a collapsed house with a hole just big enough for them to crawl through. This way, he whispered urgently. They squeezed inside, breathing heavily. The scavengers ran past, their footsteps fading. For a long moment, Mark and Lyra stayed still, listening. When it was finally safe, Lyra let out a shaky breath and gave him a look that almost seemed amused, as if to say she could not believe they had escaped. Mark chuckled softly despite the tension. That was too close, he muttered. They rested in the small shelter until nightfall. Mark shared the last of their bread, and Lyra carefully tore her piece in half and gave it back to him, insisting he eat too. You're learning fast, Mark said with a tired smile. That night, as they lay hidden in the ruins, Mark taught her a few more words. She pointed at the stars above them and said something in her language. Stars, Mark said, pointing at the sky. Stars. Stars, Lyra repeated, her voice soft but clear. It was a small moment, but it made Mark feel as if the war was very far away, as if they were just two travelers under the same sky. The next morning, they moved again. The neutral zone was still far, but Mark knew they were closer now. Each step was harder for him, not because of the distance, but because he knew the risk was growing. If they were caught, his own people might call him a traitor. But every time he looked at Lyra, he reminded himself why he was doing this. She was no longer just the enemy. She was someone who had trusted him with her life. By sunset, they reached the edge of a wide forest. Beyond the forest lay the road to the neutral zone. Mark looked at Lyra and gave her a reassuring nod. Almost there, he said. Lyra smiled faintly, her first real smile since he had found her. For Mark, that small smile was enough to keep going, no matter what waited for them next. The forest was quiet, but Mark knew silence could be dangerous. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made him tense. He and Lyra moved carefully along a narrow path, keeping to the shadows. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and oranges. Soon darkness would cover the forest, and that might help them hide, or it could make them easy prey. Lyra walked beside him, leaning slightly on his shoulder when she grew tired. Her wounds were mostly healed, but she still moved cautiously. Mark looked at her and smiled softly. Almost there, he whispered. She nodded, her violet eyes shining with trust. Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the trees. Mark froze. His heart pounded. He raised his hand, signaling Lyra to stop. He scanned the forest with his eyes and saw movement between the trees, shadows shifting unnaturally. They're here, Mark muttered under his breath. A group of humans stepped out from behind the trees. They were rogue soldiers, not part of his unit. They had guns aimed at him and Lyra. Hate and anger burned in their eyes. They were the kind who wanted all Varelians dead, no questions asked. Mark held up his hands. Wait, she's hurt. She's not dangerous. One of the rogues laughed cruelly. We don't care. You're a traitor too if you help them. Mark's heart sank. He could not fight them all, especially with Lyra still recovering. But he refused to give up. He pushed Lyra behind a tree and prepared himself. The rogues advanced, firing warning shots. Bullets whizzed past them, hitting trees and scattering leaves. Mark ducked and returned fire carefully, aiming to scare them, not to kill. His training as a medic included basic combat skills, and he used every move he knew to protect Lyra. Lyra crouched behind him, trembling at first. Then something changed in her eyes. She looked at one of the soldiers who was closing in, saw the gun in his hand, and made a decision. Mark was about to tell her to stay back, but it was too late. Lyra grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with surprising strength. She hit the soldier, knocking him off balance. He stumbled and fell into a bush. Mark's eyes widened. He had never seen her act like this before. "You're amazing," he whispered, quickly moving to cover her. The rogue soldiers shouted in anger. They were not prepared for the teamwork of a human and a Varelian working together. Lyra picked up another branch and joined Mark, helping him push back the attackers. Their movements were careful and fast, each protecting the other. One of the rogues managed to get close and fired his weapon. The bullet grazed Mark's shoulder, making him fall to the ground in pain. Blood soaked his shirt, but he gritted his teeth and refused to stay down. Lyra saw this and acted immediately. She grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it at the rogue, hitting him squarely. He fell to the side, giving Mark a chance to get up. "You okay?" Lyra asked, her voice urgent. "I will be," Mark said through gritted teeth, holding his wounded shoulder. "Thanks to you." The remaining rogues hesitated, confused by the unexpected resistance. Mark seized the moment. He pushed Lyra behind him and guided her to a small hollow in the forest. Bullets tore through the branches, but they kept moving, ducking and running as fast as they could. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, they reached a small stream. The water sparkled under the last light of the sun. Mark helped Lyra sit down and checked her briefly for injuries. She was fine, only a few scratches. Then he turned to his own wound. The cut on his shoulder was deep but not life-threatening. He tore a piece of cloth from his shirt and wrapped it tightly around it. Lyra watched him with wide eyes. "You're always helping me," she said softly, almost a whisper. "And you just saved my life," Mark replied, smiling despite the pain. They stayed by the stream for a while, listening to the water flowing and the forest slowly settling into night. Mark realized something important. Lyra was not just a Varelian he was helping. She was his partner now, someone who would fight alongside him and care for him. Their bond had grown stronger in the heat of danger. Night fell completely and the forest became quiet again. Mark and Lyra rested, keeping a small fire hidden from view. They both knew the neutral zone was still far, but this battle had shown them that together they could survive almost anything. Mark looked at Lyra sleeping beside him and whispered, "Tomorrow we move again." "Almost there?" Lyra's small hand brushed against his in sleep, and Mark felt a quiet hope. If they could survive this, maybe they could survive anything. The next morning, the forest was quiet. A soft mist hung in the air, glowing in the early sunlight. Mark woke first, his shoulder still sore but bandaged. He checked Lyra, who was sleeping peacefully with her head resting on her arm. For a moment, Mark simply watched her. She looked calm now, not like the frightened, wounded girl he had found days ago. He gently shook her shoulder. "Wake up," he said softly. "We have to keep moving." Lyra opened her violet eyes and nodded without fear. She stood a little unsteady but determined. Together they packed what little they had and continued through the forest. By midday the trees began to thin, and Mark saw something that made his heart race. The tall fence and bright banners of the neutral zone. Beyond that fence lay safety. "We made it," Mark said, smiling. Lyra looked at him, her face soft with relief. But their journey was not over yet. The area between them and the neutral zone was open ground with no cover. Mark scanned the horizon carefully. If there were patrols nearby, they could be caught. "We go slow," Mark said, motioning for her to crouch low. Step by step, they crossed the field. Every sound ended a bird cry, the crunch of grass when it made Mark tense. But no patrols appeared. At last, they reached the outer gate. 2 armed guards stood watch, one human, one Varelian. Both stared in surprise at the sight of a human soldier and a Varelian girl approaching together. "Hold your fire," Mark shouted, raising his hands. "She's not a threat." The human guard stepped forward, frowning. "Explain yourself, soldier." Mark took a deep breath. "She was wounded. Left behind. I saved her. She needs medical care and a chance to go home." The Varelian guard glanced at Lyra, then back at Mark. There was a long silence. Finally, the guard gave a slow nod. "Bring her in," the Varelian said. Relief washed over Mark. He helped Lyra through the gate. Inside the neutral zone, medics from both sides rushed forward. They guided Lyra onto a stretcher. She hesitated, looking back at Mark with wide eyes, fear returning to her face. Mark knelt beside her and gently squeezed her hand. "It's okay. Safe now," Lyra seemed to understand. Her grip on his hand loosened and she let the medics take her away. When Mark tried to follow, the human officer stopped him. "You'll have to make a report," the officer said firmly. Mark nodded. "I will, but she's safe now, right?" "She'll be treated," the officer confirmed. That was enough for Mark. Over the next few days, Mark stayed in the neutral zone, recovering from his shoulder wound. He answered questions from his superiors, telling them exactly what had happened. Some of them were angry at first, saying he had risked too much, but others were silent, as if thinking about what his actions meant. One evening, as Mark sat outside the medical tent, a Varelian officer approached. In his hand was a small note and a simple drawing. "This is for you," the officer said. Mark opened it. The drawing was of a human and a Varelian standing together under a starry sky. In the corner was a short message written in careful human letters. "Thank you, friend. Lyra." Mark smiled, his chest warm with pride. She had learned his words just to send this message. Later that night, Mark sat under the stars thinking. He had seen so much pain and destruction during the war, but this small act of kindness between two enemies, gave him hope. If one human and one Varelian could put aside hatred and work together, maybe others could too. When morning came, Mark was called to meet his commander. To his surprise, the commander said quietly, "Your actions have been noted. Some of the higher officials are discussing a possible ceasefire. What you did may have started something bigger." Mark was silent for a long moment. Then he saluted. As he left the tent, he saw the sun rising over the neutral zone. For the first time since the war began, he felt that peace was not just a dream. Somewhere on the other side of the camp, Lyra was recovering. Maybe one day, when the war was truly over, they would meet again. Not as enemies, not even as rescuer and rescued, but as equals. Mark took a deep breath and smiled. This was the beginning of something new.